Hi, guys. Welcome back. I have a wild one for you today. It involves my husband, his ex, and me deciding to become a one-woman legal department for dramatic effect. Buckle up. I'll start at the beginning. The small things, because major betrayals usually begin as tiny, polite deceptions that multiply like rabbits. We lived in a house that was the exact compromise between his idea of minimal Scandinavian and my love for thrift store velvet and indoor plants. He liked clean lines. I liked curtains that blocked the sun like hoarded secrets. Our bedroom had one of those low platform beds that makes you feel like an adult who knows what's going on. He kept his phone on the bedside table at night, always face down. I could have said that was normal, but the first red flag was a perfume. It wasn't my perfume. It was that faint, unfamiliar blend of lilies and coconut that perfumes a woman who is trying very hard to smell casual about being attractive. It was a smell on his collar one Wednesday evening after a business dinner he'd forgotten to tell me about, which is to say he'd told me, but the details had been securely deleted by his selective memory. There were other things, late work texts that started with "you up?" and ended with heart emojis, shampoo bottles that belonged to girlfriends I didn't know about, and an increasing habit of him disappearing to the bathroom and locking the door for 10 minutes at a stretch, emerging triumphant, relieved, like a man who'd cracked a particularly stubborn jar of pickles. I am not a detective by trade. I am a detective by preference. I don't like surprises in my marriage the way I don't like raisins in my cookie dough. You don't invite them in. I noticed patterns. I started timing his bathroom breaks. I learned what times he would lift his thumb to text. I became weirdly good at reading the clock on the microwave like it was a suspicious witness. I did the thing I promised myself I never would do. I looked at his phone. It was the sort of thing that feels like cheating at a game whose rules you both agreed to, but one of you forgot existed. He was asleep on his side, breathing like an exhausted man who has no idea the rug is about to be yanked. His thumb was still rhythmically curled against the blanket, a sleeping soldier. I tapped the power button. The screen achieved life. Messages. Hey, babe. Do you remember that night? Miss you. All of it casual as a coffee shop, intimate as a late-night diner. The timestamps were a scatter of late hours and afternoons when he swore. To me, he was in the office. The person on the other end was his ex. Call her Emily. I don't use real names in stories. Names have a way of suing you in your head. Emily's texts were a slow, deliberate amber of nostalgia and flirtation, like she was pouring the same wine into the same glass, inspecting it, keeping it because it tasted good once upon a time. What made everything stab sharper was the tone. He wasn't just saying hey like an old friend. He was indulging in the kind of writing style reserved for people who think they are being careful and are actually being careless. Miss you. Wish you were here. Remember that time? And worst of all, the tiny private jokes that no one else should know. At first there was fury, hot and fumy and cinematic, the kind where you imagine dramatic confrontations with growling lighting. But as I scrolled, fury settled into an incredulous, strangely calm kind of humor. He was terrible at subterfuge. He typed LOL without remembering how to abbreviate charm. He used the same phrase he used to use when trying to be romantic, which is a phrase I, frankly, had trademark rights to after 10 years together. And here's the thing. I didn't want fireworks. I didn't want him to know I knew. I wanted to see how deep the hole went before poking it with a very sharp stick. I wanted to understand whether this was a few flirtatious lines or an international airport of unresolved romance. The idea of a public blow-up appealed to my drama-starved brain like a reality TV finale, but I was also exhausted. I wanted a solution that felt like therapy, and payback rolled into one. So I did what you'd expect me to do if you know me. I started collecting evidence, screenshots, timestamps, language patterns, not to the point where it turned into a dossier. Okay, maybe a little dossier. But I kept things organized, like an archivist of humiliation. I labeled folders with names like mildly unpleasant and full stop if true. Then the stupid thing happened. He left his phone in the bathroom while he showered. The real, immortal, ancient, cosmic stupid move. He left it face up on the counter with the screen unlocked like a civic amenity. And because I am someone who believes in performance, I didn't just read his messages. I opened the conversation and started to reply. Not directly. I didn't type, "I know," or "we need to talk." No, that would have been satisfying in the short term, but pointless in the long term. I wanted to know what happened if he suddenly became a truth-telling, unapologetic drama machine. I wanted to see if the ex would run into him like moths into porch light if he really called out the past. For a while, I just watched. I typed a couple of innocuous things in his cadence, the way he uses double consonants for emphasis, the bad attempt at texting sly that ended with, to test whether Emily was even paying attention. She was. The conversation quickly resumed its slow, casual dance as if nothing had ever changed. At this point, I panicked and giggled in equal measures. There was a terrible thrill to impersonating him, to shaping sentences that would give his past a quick heart attack. My voice on that keyboard was careful at first, mimicking him so tightly that if you'd asked me for his handwriting, I could probably manage it with a crayon. But then something in me, a small, dangerous, very particular part, thought, why not push? Why not take it a step further? If he could be flirty in private while being bland in public, why couldn't I be theatrical on behalf of someone who had been dishonest? So I escalated. Not in physical ways. Not by threatening or leaving. I escalated in tone and context. If you are here for a step-by-step guide on how to ruin lives, congratulations. You're not getting one. What I did was a dramatic, performative act. It was less about the legality of the papers and more about the idea that sometimes a symbolic gesture is more damaging than a knife. I created a file. I made it look official. It was the kind of thing you see in movies where someone drops a legal-sounding document that has exactly the right font and the terrifying majesty of a stamp. It said in bold, unapologetic type, "Divorce papers" across the top. Beneath it, there were legal-sounding phrases and lots of formal spacing. Did I use a template? Maybe. Did I sign something? Maybe. The story isn't about how to forge anything. It's about what happens when someone thinks you won't. And here's the delicious part. I didn't send them to my husband. I sent them to Emily. I crafted a text on his behalf that said, very plainly and with a tone reserved for people who have tired out their own explanations, I can't keep doing this. It's not fair to you, and it's not fair to my wife. I'm filing. You'll get papers. Then I attached the divorce papers like a gift-wrapped grenade. If you think that's petty, let me be petty and proud. If you think that's cold, allow me to be winter. If you think that's illegal, perhaps. But also narratively satisfying, that's exactly the point. I wasn't trying to ruin lives I wasn't willing to live. I was trying to reveal truths that had been batched into polite daily lies. Emily's phone buzzed. The message popped up like an invitation to a party with no exit. Her reply came quick, a flurry of shock and confusion that turned into denial, then into manipulation. "What do you mean?" she wrote. "Is this a joke? Are you messing with me? How could you file without telling me? Are you serious?" I loved the way panic looked in written form. Frantic abbreviations, capitals, an exclamation point that felt like an actual shriek. She tried to charm him back with nostalgia. "Remember when we used to..." She offered future plans like bait. "We can make this work, we can be discreet." She forgot that discretion is a mutual talent. You can't be discreet with someone who puts LOL under a heart emoji and sleeps with their phone like a talisman. While she spiraled, my husband came out of the shower, towel clinging to his waist like a man in a very poorly written soap opera. His face when he saw the thread, I will never forget it. Expectation and then confusion and then a rapid-fire version of auto-defense. "What document? Who sent that? Are you messing with me? How could you..." I let him dig. Let him climb. His own rhetorical ladder. He sputtered excuses he'd used before and ones he hadn't. He claimed the messages were innocent, that it was just texting, that they meant nothing. He tried the classic "I was lonely" line, which sounds new every decade, like it's being released with a fresh marketing budget. I could have exploded then. I could have gone full opera, dragged the conversation into the living room like a show. But I'd already set up the stage. I'd gathered evidence. I'd pushed the performance. Now I let the narrative unravel in front of him. I sat there with a mug of tea and the precise, mischievous satisfaction of someone watching a magic trick work. I gave him a smile that was meant to be a courtesy and a guillotine at the same time. He tried to look down my shirt. For sympathy, I offered none. When he demanded to see the papers, I handed them over like a mother presenting a certificate of some awful achievement. He scanned the documents with the kind of focus people use when they're trying to locate a lost remote. His eyes widened in stages. The bold heading, the legalese he didn't understand but assumed was damning, the signature line, and finally the stamp that I'd printed to those suspiciously official-looking proportions. "You can't file that," he said. A sentence said in the way people say, "That's not how math works," as if paperwork required a degree in rocket science to be legitimate. He asked if I'd made a mistake, if I'd been drunk when I made the file, as if motivation and responsible consumption were exclusive categories, or if I'd been hacked. I watched him fumble. This is when the truth comes down to small moments. A wife handing her husband a stack of paper and the sound of his plan unraveling in his mouth. It was better than a TV drama. It was a private, domestic horror comedy. Emily called him from the thread. I put the phone on the counter so that his tone would have to find the truth. When he answered, his voice was small. "Hey, Em," he tried. The two of them traded small talk for a moment that sounded like two cockroaches agreeing on a plan in the dark. Then Emily asked, in a voice that quivered with confusion and maybe, I hoped, a sliver of conscience, "Are you filing? Are you serious?" The conversation was like watching two people test the elasticity of their lies. She made tentative steps toward him, offering a future painted in removable glue. He took them because what else was he supposed to do when a woman who represents possibility stood on the other side of the line, asking him to choose? He chose badly. That is to say, he chose at all. He answered with hope, with the kind of eagerness that makes betrayal feel like a hobby instead of a mistake. He plotted a fantasy of leaving. He told her things about us that made me feel like a background prop in a story about someone else's heroics. That's when I decided to stop being the ghost and start being the director. I took control by making a spectacle of honesty. Not the brutal, "I saw your messages" honesty, we'd both seen that, but a theatrical, undeniable honesty that would leave no room for revision. I opened a recording app. I recorded myself reading the texts out loud and my husband's stunned, defensive replies, not to blackmail him, not to punish him in a way that would hurt him forever, mostly to document the exact tone of his betrayals, the cadence, the casualness. You'd be surprised what a voice does to a lie. A lie on paper can be polished and argued away. A lie in the mouth is a shape you can hold and pinch. Recording was part art, part evidence, and entirely about me reclaiming the narrative voice I'd been denied. Once I had the recording, once I had those messages backed up and labeled and safe, I changed tactics. I called Emily, but not from his phone. I texted her from a burner I'd made earlier that morning in a fit of dramatic forethought. She deserved to be surprised by truth, yes, but also by the suggestion that I could outfox her. I knew what would happen in the way you know how a particularly bad romance novel will end. Someone will confess, someone will demand, someone will be left to explain their feelings with the glibness they learned from 1,000 apologies. What followed was a weird exchange of tones. She oscillated between grief, outrage, and an insistent, "We can still see each other." She was rational one minute and petulant the next, as if she believed that expedience would be awarded with contentment. Her messages became more earnest. "I didn't know he was married like that. I thought you guys were separated. Why are you doing this?" To her, I wrote back from my burner, "Because you were my husband's safety net and I just found out you were using him as one." I wrote it in plain language because sometimes plain language is the most savage. She accused me of ruining lives. I told her the truth. You were in on it. By then, the marriage was less a physical structure than a series of texts and small betrayals. It turns out that when you peel back the shiny, domesticated outer layer of someone's life, you find a raw, messy interior that has been wrapped in polite lies. He apologized. The apologies were the kind men produce when caught. Quick, rehearsed, without the architecture of real remorse. And because closure is delicious in its own right, I presented him with an ultimatum that was less a threat and more a moral consequence. Either we go to counseling and he gives up Emily entirely, not some measured we'll set boundaries nonsense, but a total cut, or the paperwork goes live. He laughed at the paperwork. You can't file without a court, he said, eyebrows doing their, I'm surprised you think institutions would actually function thing. He thought by invoking the law he'd fixed everything. He didn't understand that the papers were less about the law and more about language and spectacle. I handed him a new set of files, my conditions. They were oddly formal, terms of relationship conduct with bullet points and consequences. For someone who had always loved building spreadsheets for our family budget, there was something delicious about delivering his moral accounting in bullet points. It read like corporate HR, infractions and penalties in clean font, stipulations. For transparency, and a clause called no X's. He tried to argue the semantics. I told him the semantics had been decided by his own thumbs. He tried to bargain, with charm, with promises, with the kind of future speak that belongs in airline seatbacks and dubious Kickstarter campaigns. I'll delete her number, he offered. I'll go to therapy. Handsome, brief, insufficient. A man can promise to quit smoking after a diagnostic. A cheat can promise to stop texting. Behavior change is a long, muddy path. I told him to choose. He chose us, or at least the idea of us, in the way people choose their favorite sweater and then wonder why it shrinks. He agreed to sign a document that said he would commit to transparency, to accountability, to deleting contact lists and handing over phones on request. He agreed because he was terrified of the scene the divorce paper gesture conjured. Fear is a powerful motivator. I suppose I needed no more. We tried counseling for a while. He answered questions with the enthusiasm of someone filling out a tax form. We sat in a room with a woman who had a headset for other people's anguish, and a stack of tissues she did not need, and we spoke in the currency of honesty. It was awkward. It was necessary. It was not the fairy tale redemption arc. Months went by. He kept his phone on the counter. He learned that proximity could be used as a policy. He understood that transparency is not sympathy. I learned I could survive a lot more than I thought. He learned the art of modesty and the shame of blushing like he used to in high school when he'd been called out for passing notes. So what about Emily? She sent furious messages that eventually turned into a steady stream of apologies and then quiet absence. It's amazing how enthusiastic some people are about owning your time until claiming your time requires them to be an actual adult. She faded the way people do when they realize the cost of involvement is more than their convenience allows. And me? I sat with a mug of tea in the mornings and realized I'd been doing the hardest kind of work, picking up the shattered pieces of trust and gluing them into something rough but functional. I did it without glamour, with a lot of humor dry as toast. I cultivated a small, sharp talent for sardonic observation. I discovered that there's something cathartic about crafting a memorable exit line. The divorce papers, by the way, they never reached a courthouse. That wasn't the point. The point was theatrical, to make visible the possibility of an ending in a way that would shock the story into the open. I gave them to Emily because I wanted the affair to smell like a scandal rather than a secret. Secrets, it turns out, have a terrible way of becoming comfortable. What people sometimes forget in a narrative like this is how boring betrayal can be when stripped of its romantic veneer. It's more often a series of pedestrian choices, an extra flirty text, a missed dinner, a handshake that lasts a second longer. I didn't want something explosive. I wanted the small justice of being heard, of making a private thing public, in a way that made it impossible to deny. There were nights when I wanted vengeance that would leave scars. I wanted him to lose everything and be cold in the dark and live with the weight of regret until it calcified into something he'd carry like a stone. But I'm not a particularly cruel person. I believe in consequences, not in torture. Putting the divorce papers in Emily's inbox was enough. It was a precise surgical cut of truth that bled the secret out into sunlight. There were also moments of embarrassment. I had played a role that bordered on impersonation, and in doing so, I'd become a person I half liked and half feared. I recorded his messages. I staged scenes. I joked about being a playwright of domestic life. But humor is my coping mechanism. It's the way I put fur on the truth so it doesn't feel like bone. After a while, something remarkable happened. The frantic, all-consuming anger that had sucked my attention like an industrial vacuum began to subside. The world resumed being mundane. Dishes, work emails, the neighbor's dog that thinks everyone inside our window is there to serve it. The little betrayals receded into a history that smelled faintly of burnt toast. We didn't have a dramatic courtroom finale. We had therapy, and then we had new patterns. He'd come home and say, "I'm going to put my phone on the kitchen counter," and I would nod. It was a tiny ritual. Accountability is ultimately a string of tiny rituals. I learned to laugh. About it not because the thing became funny, but because laughter was a protective armor. Humor saved me from stalking the dark corners of what if. It let me choose the lighter view. He'd picked a terrible understudy and gotten caught with a prop that looked like paperwork. There are still nights I catch a flash of the old panic, that quick footstep of anxiety that says your foundation has been undermined. But I am sturdier now. I know my priorities. I know the difference between a mistake and a pattern. I know the sound of someone typing "miss you" against the grain of a life that used to be ours alone. If you're thinking, was I petty? Maybe. If you're thinking, was I unfair? I don't think so. Unfair would have been to let the cloud remain and then let it rain quietly on my days. This was transparency by theatrical means, a little bit of creative vandalism that cleared the air. I don't recommend it as a lifestyle choice. Don't go around inventing fake, legal instruments and sending them for kicks. But sometimes life hands you a crooked line and you straighten it in a way that feels delicious. So what's the moral? Maybe it's that honesty wins when it's wielded honestly. Or that sometimes the meanest thing you can do to a lie is to make it visible. Or that you should always remember to lock the bathroom door. Or maybe the moral is simpler. Never underestimate a woman with a folder and a sense of humor. Here's the last scene I'll leave you with. I was sitting at the kitchen island one morning very early, the kind of light that makes my plants thrilled. And my husband, the man who had once considered secrecy an acceptable pastime, placed his phone face up on the counter and shrugged like a man with nothing left to hide. He looked at me and without irony said, "I know I screwed up." He said it like a confession at a confessional. In that sentence was the whole story of the months before. I said, "Thank you." It was not forgiveness wrapped in glitter. It was acknowledgement. It was the adult thing to say. He looked at me with the mixture of gratitude and shame you get when you've been given a second chance, and you know you must be better because someone else has already paid. A second chance is a dangerous, fragile thing. It must be handled like a delicate vase. And me? I filed the emotional paperwork, and then I put the actual papers into a small box and placed them on a shelf like a relic from a war I'd won but didn't want trophies from. Sometimes I scroll back through the screenshots, not out of malice, but because they are a record that I once stood up for myself in a peculiar, performative way. It was less about justice and more about reclaiming the narrative. Before I go, because every video needs an outro, and I'm aware that you're probably waiting to unleash your judgment in the comments, I'll say this. I don't recommend reenacting this saga in your living room. The legal system exists for a reason, and forging documents is both illegal and reckless. But if you ever find yourself reading your partner's messages and realizing they've been writing chapters of their life in margins you weren't allowed to see, remember, you deserve to be the protagonist of your own story. So, what would you have done? Would you have confronted him with a dramatic scene, or quietly packed your dignity and left? Would you have sent the papers, staged the confrontation, or stormed out like a character in a TV drama? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear what you think and how you would have handled it. If you like this story, hit the like button, subscribe for more, and leave a comment. I read every single one. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next story. Bye.